Hi, and welcome back. Hopefully you took full advantage of the break and look forward to the next one based on our first panel discussion titled Protecting, and I have gotten far ahead of myself, people, so hold on for 1 second. Protecting a future talent pipeline after COVID-19, increasing third grade reading proficiency. Now, if you know anything about our education and workforce conferences, then you know how important third grade reading proficiency is to us. That's because we know it is the most important milestone in a child's educational development and the foundation for all learning. Now, we must dedicate our attention to the educational reading achievement of all children if North Carolina is to remain the best state for business and continue to provide a high quality of life for its citizens. After all, by the time a child reaches 5th grade, 85% of the curriculum is taught through reading. Now, whether we are parents, educators, volunteers, or business leaders, we all can play a role. This next panel will discuss what the business community and those in academia are doing around third grade reading proficiency. Joining us are Sepi Saidi, CEO at Sepi Inc., Trey Rabon, President of AT&T North Carolina, Dr. Anthony Graham, Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Winston-Salem State University, and our moderator, Dr. Ann Bullock, Dean of the College of Education at Elon University. Sepi?
Good morning, Deborah. I am so happy to be here today on this very important topic. Today's conference focuses on how and why North Carolina businesses, our state's employers, need to truly engage in our efforts to increase educational attainment in North Carolina. These efforts need to be business-driven so we can be sure that employers have a talent pipeline with the skills they need, and those who are already in the workforce and the ones who are coming, we want to make sure that they have opportunities for good jobs and upward mobility. The need to increase educational attainment has become very clear as we look at the significant inequalities in our country. They are further exacerbated by the impacts of COVID-19, and the protests continuing around our country show how vital it is that we achieve racial equality and justice. On slide 2, a lot of the discussion today will be around important efforts to meet current skills needs, as well as the skills needed through 2030. The date set for reaching North Carolina's educational attainment goal. But as business leaders, we cannot forget the need for a strong talent pipeline beyond 2030. Keeping our eye on the long-term prospects, not just for our own companies, but the long-term sustainability of our state's economy requires that we stay focused on the need to increase third grade reading proficiency. And I have to say, we have a long way to go. Next slide, please. It cannot be emphasized enough that third grade reading proficiency is one of the most important milestones in a child's educational journey, which will break down the barriers to true equality. There is the old saying, through third grade, children learn to read. After third grade, they read to learn. Next slide, please. We know that if a child meets this critical education milestone, he or she is 3 times more likely to graduate high school and go on to post-secondary training or education in a high-skill area. On the other hand, if this milestone is not met, that student is 4 times more likely to drop out of school. And we also know that students of color disproportionately struggle to achieve this milestone. This is a real problem if we want to ensure we have a strong talent pipeline and ensure everyone has the opportunity to succeed in whatever career path they choose. So what is the state of early reading proficiency in North Carolina? It's not good. Next slide. I'm sure many of you remember a study that came out in late 2018 about the results of Read to Achieve, a legislation that passed in 2012 to ensure children are reading proficiently by the end of the 3rd grade. The goal of Read to Achieve is absolutely right. We must do everything to ensure children are reading proficiently at the end of 3rd grade. But the study from North Carolina State University found that 6 years after Read to Achieve became law, just a little over half of our state's 3rd graders are reading at grade level. Next slide. The flat results documented by North Carolina State were confirmed late last year when the results from NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the Nation's Report Card, were released. This is a national assessment which began in 1969 that is given every 2 years on reading and math proficiency of 4th and 8th graders. It is the best way for states to determine how they are doing in comparison with each other. When the 2019 results were released in North Carolina, the findings were quite troubling. They found only 36% of our 4th graders are proficient in reading, a 3% drop from the 2017 NAEP scores. Although some have said these 2019 results are not a statistically significant change from the 2017, but 36% proficiency is way too low and will not be sufficient for our talent line. Next slide. When the NAEP results are separated by race, ethnicity, and gender, the trends are even worse. Declines in NAEP scores were especially significant for boys overall, and particularly for Black boys, who scored 25 points lower than white students. We also saw disparities in scores for Hispanic students, which were 21 points below white students. And we saw that economically disadvantaged students scored 26 points lower than their more economically advantaged peers. Next slide. We also saw that while the percentage of North Carolina students scoring proficient or higher has stayed about the same, the percentage who scored at the lowest levels has risen, meaning that while the same percentage of students are exceeding, more students are failing to reach even a minimum level of achievement. Please understand that North Carolina is not alone in highly disappointing NAEP scores. What we are seeing in our state mirrors a nationwide decline in scores. But those that mean we just say it's okay because we are doing all about the same as everybody else. But for North Carolina, that's not acceptable. North Carolina has always been a leader, and we want to be a leader again. The devastating impacts of COVID-19 and the conversation that is front and center from the protests have pulled back the curtain on racial inequality that impacts even our youngest students. As we continue to recover, we know our education system may never look like it did before, And that is something that the professionals have to work through it. It's going to be a major struggle. However, in determining how we can strengthen our education system, learning from that is occurring. We must stay laser focused on the importance of third grading proficiency and undertake the necessary steps to ensure every child in North Carolina meets this critical education milestone. Next slide. I am excited to be part of a group of North Carolina business leaders who have been working together since 2017 to increase third grade reading proficiency. We are committed, along with the North Carolina Chamber, to continue that work, and progress is being made. In closing, I want to say that as we work to improve third grade reading proficiency, I see the problem as an engineer. When something is not working, you don't give up and accept where you are as the status quo. You fix it. And our goal in North Carolina is to fix it and exceed the national average. I'm going to now turn it over to Trey, President of AT&T North Carolina, to update you on some of our efforts here in North Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Sepi. Thank you to our partners at North Carolina Chamber for hosting this very timely and critically important conference. Good morning to all the attendees. As Sepi said, we, along with the North Carolina Chamber, have been working on various policy recommendations detailed in the 2017 Business Roundtable report. Today, I want to focus on one of those recommendations: increasing access to North Carolina pre-K, our high-quality program for 4-year-olds. Why? Because it works. Next slide. Duke University has studied this program for over 16 years. This is the longest longitudinal study of its kind in the US and resulted in 4 critical findings. Participation in North Carolina pre-K increases reading proficiency. It increases math proficiency. It reduces placement in special education at a big savings to the state. And it decreases the chance of a student being held back a grade. Duke also found that these benefits last through at least the 8th grade. That is simply extraordinary. Next slide. Our goal, supported by research, is 75% enrollment for all North Carolina pre-K eligible children in every county across the state. Next slide. Last year, after Read to Achieve results were released, the General Assembly's Program Evaluation Division was asked to look at economically disadvantaged counties that had high achieving students and figure out what those counties were doing to get that result. The answer? They were enrolling 75% or more of their eligible children in North Carolina pre-K. Next slide. Achieving 75% enrollment in every county will also help address very real disparities in achievement across our state. As you can see on this map, about a quarter of our counties are enrolling at least 75% of their North Carolina pre-K eligible children, but 3/4 are not, with some serving less than 20 or 30%. With outcomes that Duke and the Program Evaluation Division have documented, this is simply not acceptable. Next slide. When our work started in 2017, only about 43% of North Carolina pre-K eligible children were able to participate. That meant that over 36,000 children could not access the program. With the work of many, including our CEO group, we have seen the first meaningful increases in North Carolina pre-K funding over the last 4 years. We thank the General Assembly and Governor Cooper for their support and for those increases. Next slide. Unfortunately, even with those funding increases, over 30,000 children eligible for North Carolina pre-K cannot access the program. I'm afraid these numbers will be even higher now because of the devastating economic impacts of COVID-19. Next slide, please. In addition to the patchwork of enrollment levels across the state, over the last 3 years, we have seen many counties decline increased funding to expand their North Carolina pre-K programs. In 2017, 44 counties declined. 34 counties declined in 2018. And last year, well, 34 counties declined again, including Wake County. As you may know, we commissioned the National Institute of Early Education Research, or NEAR, to figure out what was going on. Next slide. NEAR's findings were released by our group early last year. NEAR found that because the state funding structure requires counties to cover 40% of the cost of North Carolina pre-K, too many counties simply cannot afford to expand. NEAR also found difficulties recruiting and retaining qualified teachers, funding transportation, and finding more classroom space. Next slide. NEAR's findings resulted in legislation that we supported last year, House Bill 886, which requires a county-by-county survey to determine challenges to both expanding and maintaining North Carolina pre-K. It directed DHHS, who did the survey, to recommend ways to restructure state funding to address those challenges. And very importantly, it set the goal of enrolling 75% of North Carolina pre-K eligible children in every county across the state. The results from House Bill 886 survey were submitted to the General Assembly in June of this year. Next slide. From those recommendations, our group of business leaders, the North Carolina Chamber, the North Carolina Bankers Association, and numerous local chambers of commerce are asking for the following modifications to the state's North Carolina pre-K funding structure to address challenges to maintaining and expanding the program, and to reach the goal of enrolling 75% of eligible children in every county. Next slide. We suggest adjusting the state's funding for inflation, which has not occurred since 2012, and require an annual inflation adjustment going forward. We believe it's important to modify county and state cost sharing percentages to account for the economic well-being of counties, using the county distress tiers as follows. For Tier 1 counties, we propose that counties provide 20% of the funding, with states providing 80% of the funding. In Tier 2 counties, the counties would provide 30% of the funding, and the state would provide 70% of the funding. In Tier 3 counties, counties would provide 40% of the funding, and the state would provide 60% of the funding. We also suggest targeting funds to raise willing 4- and 5-star childcare centers to meet North Carolina pre-K qualifications, and target funding to address specific challenges such as transportation, classroom space, and teacher compensation. Next slide. Increasing access to North Carolina pre-K is even more imperative now than ever. Rigorous research confirms that when entering kindergarten, African American children are nearly 9 months behind in math and 7 months behind in reading compared to their white, non-Hispanic peers. The ability to participate in high-quality programs like North Carolina pre-K will reverse these numbers and level the playing field for every child. Recognizing we are in a very difficult budget situation, we hope to work with all of you to continue expanding access to North Carolina pre-K during next year's biennial budget negotiations. This needs to be a priority for our state. Thank you. And let me turn things over to Provost Anthony Graham.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss third grade reading proficiency in the state of North Carolina. Next slide, please. When we examined the nation's fourth grade reading data as reported by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, student performance data clearly indicate that we must begin to think differently about the way we teach our students to read and how we teach our classroom teachers to provide reading instruction. NAEP data from 2019 indicate what has been true for almost 30 years, that there are persistent gaps in reading proficiency between racial, ethnic, gender, and socioeconomic groups. Data indicate that Asian Pacific Islander and white students perform at a higher rate of proficiency on the fourth grade reading assessment, while Black, Hispanic, and other students of color lag behind. When you disaggregate those data by gender, we see Black and Hispanic male students lagging even farther behind. There are two main points that I want to make before I move forward. First, what is criminal is that these performance gaps have persisted since at least 1992, with very little closure of the gap during that time. And secondly, what I want to highlight, that even those students who are performing well on this scale, our Asian Pacific Islander students and our white students, really are not performing at a very high level at all. While they may be outperforming other racial and ethnic groups, they really aren't setting the world ablaze with their performance. My point is this: there's work that we must do to improve the reading proficiency for all students. Next slide, please. There's a recommendation from the Business Roundtable's 2017 report that has not been discussed previously at this conference. Ensure that teachers and principals are fully trained to provide their students with the foundational reading skills they need. I wholeheartedly agree with this recommendation. Unfortunately, we are not consistently preparing our teachers and principals to teach our youngest students to read. They are not being instructed on how young children actually learn the skill of reading. Next slide, please. Across our university system in both public and private institutions of higher education, our colleges and schools of education have the latitude to prepare pre-service elementary teachers in whatever way they deem is appropriate. As the National Council on Teacher Quality indicates with their grading of educator preparation programs and their ability to teach reading, some institutions are performing very well, where other institutions are not. This results in a great deal of variance when it comes to the preparedness and effectiveness of our classroom educators to teach early reading. Unfortunately, that lack of preparedness and effectiveness continues throughout our teachers' careers because they have not been taught how to teach early literacy skills. This lack of consistency results in the perpetual reality that we have faced for nearly 3 decades in the state of North Carolina: the production of large numbers of struggling readers across the state. Until we have teachers and principals who consistently teach students how to read based upon the established science of reading, then the harsh truth is we will continue to produce struggling readers. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? I argue there are two issues that contribute to our persistent struggles as a state and perhaps even as a nation with respect to early literacy school skills and student reading proficiency. First, the variance in the way we teach reading, and second, who learns to teach reading in our educator preparation programs. Allow me to explain first the science of reading. With this approach, elementary teachers learn how to teach according to 5 components of reading, which is perceived very much as a scientific process where students move through phases in a sequential manner. Phase 1 is phonemic awareness, where the goal is to develop students' awareness of sounds made by spoken words. Then phase 2, phonics, where systematic mapping of those speech sounds onto letters and letter combinations occur. Phase 3 is fluency, giving students extended practice for reading words so that they learn to read without a lot of effort, allowing them to devote their mental energy to the meaning of the text. Phase 4 is vocabulary, building student understanding of numerous words. The more expansive your vocabulary, then the more fluent you will become in your reading, which allows you to focus even more on understanding the meaning of the text. And phase 5 is comprehension, developing students' understanding of what is being read to them and eventually what they will learn to read themselves. There are two things I want to note here. First, there's the belief in this approach that a student must become proficient in one phase before moving to the next phase. And secondly, it is possible that a student may get stuck in a phase and may never transition out of that phase if there is not intentionality to provide reading instruction to move him or her to the next level. Thus, it is highly plausible that a person may remain stuck in a phase for the entirety of his or her life. Next slide. Unfortunately, many of our educator preparation programs across the state and nation only immerse our elementary teachers in instruction about the science of reading. And even that approach has variance, which I will discuss more in a few minutes. Generally, our secondary teachers, our teachers who are licensed from grades 7 to 12, may not receive any instruction on the science of reading. Typically, these teachers focus on their disciplinary content and how to teach that content, but not really on how to teach reading. Here's the problem. If I'm a 7th grade teacher and I have a 7th grade student who has gotten stuck in the fluency phase, for example, then that means that student will struggle with reading comprehension. But I'm responsible for teaching disciplinary content that requires reading comprehension. This means that student will not only struggle in my classroom because he won't be able to read and comprehend the material, but also I am ill prepared as a classroom teacher to provide any type of reading instruction that may move this student from the fluency phase to the vocabulary phase, then ultimately from the vocabulary phase to the comprehension phase. I will continue to teach my discipline content as I normally would, and this student will remain trapped in the fluency phase throughout the academic year, falling farther behind in the classroom, which may likely mean the student will begin to act out more in my class, and I will likely see more disciplinary issues. All of these issues are interrelated, and frequently they map back to student literacy skills. Next slide. Very quickly, allow me to explain the early literacy instructional approach that rivals the science of reading. It's referred to as whole language or balanced literacy. Whole language involves cueing. Essentially, this approach asserts that people make predictions about words on a page as they read using cues. This approach relies on repetition and pictures, paying attention to meaning, sentence structure, and visual information. Essentially, the reader is guessing what a word or a phrase or a sentence means based on cues, and it is not grounded in a scientific approach. Being able to read words in isolation quickly and accurately is the hallmark of a skilled reader. Having the ability to decode words is grounded in a scientific process, not in guesswork, not in memorization, not in cueing. Next slide. What transpires in North Carolina is not uncommon across the United States. Within a single educator preparation program, multiple faculty may teach early literacy instruction in different ways. 2 faculty may agree with the science of reading approach, and 2 faculty in that same department may subscribe to the whole language or balanced literacy approach. Obviously, the same holds true across educator preparation programs. The beliefs of faculty across these institutions may vary widely as they would within a single institution. If that's not problematic enough, the K-12 schools may prescribe to a reading approach that varies significantly from the reading approach of an educator preparation program, where pre-service teacher candidates may have learned to teach early literacy in a completely different way. Next slide, please. This results in significant differences in the knowledge and skills that pre-service teachers have when they enter the classroom, and it will not improve as they continue their teaching careers. More frightening for me is that in spite of all this variance, which has persisted for decades, we continue to trudge down the same path using the approach expecting something vastly different. Then we find ourselves shocked when we have the same outcomes. My colleagues, we have seen the enemy, and he is us. What we must do is learn from other states that have made progress in the area of reading. What I can promise you is that these states felt extremely disturbed and decided to challenge the status quo, trying something vastly different to move the needle. One such state is Mississippi. Next slide. For the last 2 releases of NAEP scores, or over the last 4 years, Mississippi stands alone in showing significant increases in 4th grade reading, which begs the question, why? Last August, I traveled to Mississippi with a group of North Carolina educators and other stakeholders to understand what was happening. We spent an entire day listening to the Mississippi State School Superintendent, as well as university deans and faculty, community college presidents, classroom teachers, principals, and others. What we learned is that many years ago, Mississippi recognized it was tired of being at the bottom of student achievement, and policymakers, K-12 educators, faculty from educator preparation programs, the business community, and other stakeholders worked to construct a collective strategy where they intentionally focused on 3rd grade reading proficiency. Consequently, They grounded their approach in the science of reading. After implementing a variety of measures, they seem to have developed a combination of policies and practices that have resulted in an increase in fourth grade reading proficiency from 26% in 2013 to 39% in 2019. While this gain looks modest on the surface, it is actually quite significant, particularly given the short period of time. Next slide, please. For me, there are three things that our colleagues and friends in Mississippi figured out. First, the collective body of influencers in Mississippi recognized that the same curriculum and the same coursework needed to be taught in all of their colleges of education, both public and private. They now require Early Literacy 1 and Early Literacy 2, so 2 semesters of science-based reading instruction. Secondly, Mississippi recognized that its in-service teachers and its faculty in schools and colleges of education needed to be on the same page. They needed to have the same operationalized definition. They all needed to understand the science of reading, so our colleagues in Mississippi retained a professional development organization called LETRS, LETRS, to train in-service teachers and college faculty. As a result, when beginning teachers enter the classroom, they are well instructed on the science of reading, and they are teaching based on that science. More importantly, the professional development that occurs benefits everyone across the spectrum of K-12 to educator preparation programs because they are all singing from the same hymnal, on the same page, in the same key. Finally, Mississippi recognized that its in-service teachers needed additional mentoring, especially those who were teaching in low-performing schools or in economically disadvantaged districts. So Mississippi trained 80 literacy coaches and placed them across the state, prioritizing low-performing schools and those that were economically disadvantaged. Those coaches are limited to no more than 2 schools. Next slide, please. Mississippi chose to focus on strengthening the effectiveness of its teachers, not solely trying to raise the performance of struggling students. Mississippi chose teacher mentoring, teacher development, and investments in educator preparation programs over student tutoring in summer camps. Obviously, 39% performance is not what any state desires. However, making a significant increase from the bottom of the pack to the middle of the pack in a very short period of time deserves the attention of policymakers, educators, and others. Next slide. What has been happening in Mississippi has gotten our attention in North Carolina. We're starting to see in North Carolina what I think is the foundation of a very similar movement to that occurred in Mississippi. We have a number of work groups that have begun trying to articulate a singular approach to early literacy grounded in the science of reading, including the UNC Educator Preparation Program Advisory Council, which I'm honored to co-chair, the UNC Board of Governors Resolution, the State Board of Education Early Literacy Task Force, and the State Board of Education's adoption of policy recommendations. Going forward, there will be roles for others to play, including the General Assembly, the Governor's Office, and other entities to address curricula, licensure, and accreditation. Next slide, please. With respect to the role of the business community, I recognize that what I've been discussing has been pretty deep in the weeds: curricula, mentoring, professional development. But there is an important role for business to play in this discussion. As we have laid out, achieving third grade reading proficiency is crucial to a strong talent pipeline. We need the voices of the business community to emphasize that reading proficiency is not solely an education issue, but also an economic development and economic growth issue. The business community needs to support these policy shifts and urge that the state support them in both policy decisions and funding. If we are truly serious about equity issues in this state, racial equity, socioeconomic equity, gender equity, then we must pay greater attention to our students' abilities to read well. Research has illustrated time and time again that an individual who reads well will experience greater academic achievement, which will in turn afford that person more educational and economic opportunities. Conversely, Those individuals who struggle with reading will likely earn significantly less income in his or her lifetime, and we will likely see more of those individuals unemployed, underemployed, or imprisoned. I will not say that reading proficiency is the solution to inequities in our society, but I will say that it is a major variable in addressing the problem. Thank you again for allowing me to engage you.
I'd like to thank all our panel members for those excellent presentations and some great things for us to think about. We do have some questions in the Q&A. If you have a question, please put it there. We'll either answer it now or we'll try to provide an answer later. Our first question is from Sandy Wheat. As a former elementary teacher, I am keenly aware that the learning that happens at home prior to a child entering school significantly impacts their ability to read at grade level, which impacts third grade. How can businesses encourage their employees to read to their children and have a print-rich environment at home? Could incentives be provided to the parents of preschool children? Trey, would you like to take that?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Bullock. Businesses do have a responsibility to our employees and to our greater community at large. And well, what you see, particularly here in the Triangle, businesses that are located in a campus environment, our larger businesses typically have preschool caliber programs on site for their employees and strongly encourage their employees to participate. And it allows for direct engagement between employees and their children and helps harness that potential energy. Yeah, but we do have a greater responsibility to our communities at large. We need to focus on ensuring that the children, pre-K level up through third grade, have opportunities, to read and have people investing in them. AT&T, for example, has a program called AT&T Believe, in which we have partnered in Durham with Fayetteville Street Elementary School. To allow our employees after school to come in, support students, read to students, and it's open not just for those students, but for their siblings and their families, so that they have an opportunity to, one, interact with the business community, but two, to see the importance of academic enrichment and development of our students. And I think that there are other businesses that are doing similar programs around the state. The challenge that we have right now in the COVID-19 environment is it's very difficult, to go into the community. Schools aren't there. I had a very good conversation with a nonprofit in Charlotte, that is now carrying reading labs, learning labs into communities. And there's opportunities for businesses to partner with programs like that, to really make a difference in the lives of our young people. We've got a responsibility, to invest, not just financially and not just academically, but in terms of our time and our talents, and to really pour into our community so that our students, understand the importance of reading and academic enrichment.
Thank you, Trey. The next question is from my colleague, Algie Gatewood. Industry knows that the workforce is aging and it is an imperative to replace those workers. Every day, 10,000 baby boomers will reach retirement age for the next 19 years. That's 3.65 million per year. We also know by 2030, the United States could experience unrealized revenue of 1.748 trillion due to labor shortage from attrition, retiring workers, et cetera. That's 6% of our economy. What are your thoughts on how we may accelerate the academic and skills advancement of people of color to help fill some of the better paying, high skilled jobs? Sepi, would you like to start with an answer for that one?
I can start. This is a very, very important question. And it's a question that really requires some thinking and brainstorming. The reality is that we're going to lose the workforce. They are retiring, although they're staying longer. but also very important about racial equality. How do we, I believe the question was, how can we create a more diverse workforce by investing in our minorities to make sure they come in. I think for me personally, as a business owner, although I always believe that I am an aware citizen, that I understand inequality, I understand injustice, I understand I'm an immigrant, I've lived in Raleigh all my life for 4 decades, but it's I always understood the sense of being somebody who enters a new environment. But the recent events of all the uprising and what happened in the society, it brought to me personally another sense of urgency about what we need to do as a society. I think it really goes into more public policy topics. I think there should be a combination of business leaders and public policy advisors to come together and create a more comprehensive plan that is not just for my business or for AT&T. It's that we are all more aware of the importance of this topic, to pay attention to it, to embrace and understand that when people come from diverse backgrounds, I always have said this in my workforce, we don't come in the front door with the same experiences. Although businesses look at the resume, okay, you got a civil engineering degree and you have a civil engineering degree. If you're African-American woman or white, we were looking at your degree, but you can't look at that because every individual's life experiences impacts how they walk into that environment. And I think it's just a lot of conversation, a lot of awareness. I'm going on too long, but it's important. Great question and really important. And I think business owners and individuals, we all have to recognize the importance of supporting minorities, their education, supporting teachers. So it should be a public policy conversation as well.
Thank you, Sepi. That was a great answer. So Dr. Graham, the question here, so maybe a little bit more loaded. As you noted, this is from Lisa, as you noted, the ongoing mentoring coaching of teachers is critical. This seems to be missing in many states' policies. Do you think this will be part of North Carolina's policy changes?
It's a great question. I hope so. We tend to give a lot of attention to other areas. You know, we attack the problem, if you will, by thinking about how do we address student deficiency, but we may not be thinking enough about how do we also enhance and improve our teachers' knowledge, their skills, their abilities to do their work, particularly providing them with mentoring and coaching so that they're learning as they go through the process how to get better at what they do. As a former football player, I will tell you, I was made better as a football player because of my coaches. They're able to see what I do and then kind of, take me, and then we can sit down and take a look at what I did, talk about how I did it, and then try to figure out a better path forward. These are the types of things that we have to ensure that we're investing with our classroom teachers, grades K through 12, and not solely grades K through 3. I think this is another mistake we tend to make, particularly in the literacy space. We focus only on grades K through 3 or K through 5, but we forget about those secondary teachers as well. If students are making it to them and they're struggling to read, those secondary teachers have an obligation to be able to move those students through those phases that we talked about earlier in the science of reading. So we have to invest a great deal more energy, resources, and time in the coaching, mentoring, development of our classroom teachers, and not solely our K-12 students.
Thank you. We have time for one more follow-up question, and the question, it's in several of the questions that's been asked, and Trey, this is for you. What is the nonprofit at Charlotte that offers those labs?
It's a nonprofit, Do Greater Charlotte, which leverages technology. They have converted, a Lance cracker truck, into a mobile learning lab that they carry in the cul-de-sacs of communities, carry it into underserved communities, at-risk communities in Charlotte. They are also partnering with a local church, to build a community-based learning lab in a very, very distressed area of Charlotte. But Do Greater Charlotte is the name of the nonprofit.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for all joining our panel. There are some folks that have put other resources in the chat. So if you know of other resources to help rural communities or low-income communities or communities in general about reading, please put them there. And thanks to all the panelists for joining us today.